Welcome, everybody, to this remote interview. My name is Lisette, and I'm interviewing people and companies doing great things remotely. Today, on the line, all the way from the UK, I have David Smith. David, you are a digital workplace consultant working to support teams to develop their virtual fluency. And you're kind of a cultural intelligence expert, or you have expertise in cultural intelligence, shall we say. We're going to dive into that in just a second. But what
Sure.
I want to first start with is, what does your virtual office look like? And what do you need to get your work done?
Okay, so my virtual office, I know that for many, virtual for them became as a result of COVID. I started virtually probably about 15 years ago. Did it like most people did, north end of a dining room table, migrated into actually working from a bedroom that we'd converted into a home office. And now my actual day-to-day office is actually, I'm going to call it a summer house. I used to call it a log cabin, but that seemed to actually talk about some, big wooden building in the woods. But it's traditionally it's a summer house here in the UK. It's 24 feet by 16 feet. In it, I have what you would actually regard as a normal office setup: two computers, two screens, studio microphone, speakers. One side of the room is actually my operational desks, if you like, and I'm here pretty much most of the time when I'm not on site with clients or speaking at conferences. The other side is my fitness piece, and I guess as most people actually made the move to virtual, of course, we lose our commute, we lose some of those social elements that we do. I'm a kickboxer. In fact, my entire family kickbox. So the other side of my desk, as I look over the top of my webcam, I can see a kickbox stand, punch bag, running machine, and dare I say, if I want to just stop and think, okay, I want to do kind of half an hour, take out some frustration on the punch bag, or just put in that sort of 5 minutes worth of exercise, or I'm not commuting in the same way. I've got 20 paces across my garden, so I still need to actually and want to stay that active and moving. So very different, I guess, than a lot of people. But, I went remote, went virtually, as I say, probably about 15 years ago.
I love that. During the pandemic, I also started to notice I was gaining weight because I wasn't going out as much. I mean, I've always worked remotely, but for some reason, I think the lockdowns and just being in the house. And so I got myself a virtual personal trainer who
Okay.
assigns me workouts on an app and then can tell if I've done the workouts using my iWatch. So there's
Right.
like a level of accountability there. And there's a real person behind the app. Like we had a meeting and everything. His name is Cody, some guy in Ohio. And I've lost 6 kilos over the last 3 years. So go do it. Yeah, it is possible to do it from home. So
Oh,
there is
I
an
think
app for that.
I think like everything else, as more and more of us have gone to remote worlds or virtual working, what we've got to remember is that if we were doing that regular commute to the office, we had an element of exercise. And if you think about it, I define exercise as just movement.
Oh
If I'm
yeah.
sat at my desk all day, every day, I'm not moving in the same way. But if I was commuting in and out of a city, okay, I'm probably going to use a vehicle of some sort of transport to get there. But there's a lot more movement than we would have if we were actually just sat at our desks all the time.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing how quickly you can get to 10,000 steps just walking from the train to the office and then around the
Absolutely.
office and then back. Yeah, so it's amazing, amazing indeed. That 20 steps across your garden, it takes a long time to get to 10,000 steps
I
again.
know. I've got to do a lot of trips back and forth to get that step count.
Exactly. All right, so let's dive in to. I said in the beginning that you're a digital workplace consultant helping teams to develop virtual fluency. My first question for you is, what is virtual fluency? What does that mean to you?
That's a great question. I mean, I guess, and I was just reading a piece of research this morning from Gallup Workplace that was saying that only something like 8, 9% of leaders and the managers had some sort of formalized training to actually work in a virtual world or to work remotely. So virtual fluency is a holistic approach that we take, which says if what we're actually trying to achieve in today's business world, working remotely, working virtually, is to connect with people, to communicate with people, and to collaborate with people, then what we need to be doing is thinking beyond just a technology solution. Many organizations will turn around and say, well, hey, we needed you to go virtually So now you're going to have access to Microsoft Teams. You might have a bit of project management software. You've got email, you've got Slack or some other instant messaging tool. But the reality for us, that is only one part of the equation. It's part of what we would regard as the essential tool sets that are needed for us if we actually are going to work more effectively in a virtual world. Beyond that, and the pieces that we see that are often missing, and the Gallup Workplace kind of looked at that and said that something like 92% of these managers and leaders that were being interviewed had no formalized training. So
Wow.
there's a whole sense of we've got to develop what are the critical skill sets. So I know how to communicate, I know how to connect, but how do I do that in the digital workplace? How do I do that across technology, across time zone? And then the final part is how do we develop what we call the crucial mindsets? So it's not enough for us to have the tools and the skills to use the tools. We've now got to put ourselves into, okay, how do I make it a better event for us if we're actually meeting virtually? You know, what are the mindsets that I need to have as a leader or as a remote worker that I've got to make those adaptations or those adjustments, if you like, to now not just having a meeting, but having a meeting in a digital context. So it's about how does the technology change the way in which I do? How do I need in a virtual event to change the way in which I ask for questions? You know, I mean, if you think about it, give you a small example. If we're face to face and we're in a meeting of people, I can see by your body language, you're leaning forward. You know, you've maybe got your hand raised, ready to actually interject and get involved in the conversation. We lose that to some extent virtually. So what it needs is the person that's holding that virtual meeting, instead of actually asking questions in the general sense of, okay, who's got a question? And just waiting for that kind of silence to kind of become a little bit awkward. We've spoken about this in previous sessions. And then somebody suddenly, oh, go on then, I'll ask my question. You know, what we've got to do is to turn around and give people more direction. So it's, who's got a question? Go ahead and raise your hand in Zoom. Who's got a question? Go ahead and put it in chat. You know, changing the conversation from not who's got a question to what questions do you have, assuming that there's going to be questions from your group. So, you know, I mean, I got into doing the work that I do as part of helping companies upskill for virtual classroom delivery 12, 13 years ago. You know, as the move from face-to-face to virtual started to come more into a blended learning. And, you know, a lot of the skills that we've been working with over those 12 years are there, whether you're running a virtual training session or whether you're now running a virtual meeting with your people. And I've always had this fascination around virtual teamwork, remote working, I guess partly because I've been doing it for 15 years myself. It's easily, with the exception of maybe a 2-year tenure, it's easily 15 years since I've been in an office on a regular basis.
So I have a million questions, but first of all, so what do you like about remote working so much personally? What's in it for you?
You know, wow, there's so many different elements to that. The first and foremost for me is having the ability to actually schedule periods of deep work. You know, Newport in his book actually talks about the fact that, you know, in today's world, if we actually think about the face-to-face training, face-to-face office, often we'll get interruptions and distractions. You know, somebody walks past your cubicle, somebody new comes into the office, you get a disruption and you get a distraction. Whereas what I found, and probably even more so since COVID, I found more that I'm able to section off some good quality time on my schedule for that deep work. Because we've got this summer house that we use as our remote office, my son and my wife, they know that if I'm in the office and the door's closed, it's a no entry zone.
Right.
You know, I could be on anything from a podcast, I could be running a virtual session with our clients, I could be on client meeting calls or review calls. They know the minute I'm out here, I'm kind of off the radar for them. But equally, they know at the other end of that, the minute I come out of this office and shut the door, I'm theirs again. You know, so it's that very nice balance between work life and personal life. There's the fact that and I know that this might rile some of our viewers or listeners to the podcast, in that I feel as though I'm very grateful that I have a dedicated workspace that is not the north end of a dining room table. It's not some space that we've managed to squeak out of the house. It's a dedicated workspace. And with the exception of, having a punch bag and a running machine in the corner, you could be forgiven for thinking this side of the desk is a normal desk. It's quite funny. A lot of folks, when they actually start working remotely and virtually, talk about the feelings of isolation that they get because they're not seeing colleagues on a regular enough basis and all the rest of that. And of course, there's all the antagonists who are actually going to turn around and say, well, oh, you can't build relations digitally. I'm not going to swear on the podcast, but ultimately I want to just scream at those people and say, that is rubbish. That is utter rubbish. Some of my best friends I've never met physically. And the first time I meet them, I'm hugging them like they're old friends, like I've known them since school days.
Totally.
So
Yeah.
I think, I could answer the question and keep going, but that would use up the rest of the time that we've got for this podcast.
And we all have our own reasons, but I like to understand the why behind people, going remote, because people have very different reasons. Some of it's for the freedom, some of it's to be with
Of course.
family. Yeah, all those kind of things. So back to the virtual fluency though, before I move on to some other things, which is how do you know, as a leader, it really strikes me that 92% have had no formalized training. That's the statistics that I wrote down. How do we know our level of virtual fluency? How do I know how do I know if I'm virtually fluent? I mean, I'm assuming these leaders don't know what they don't know.
And there's a huge part of it. I mean, in learning and development, we talk about the state of unconscious incompetence, which is the fact of we don't know what we don't know. There's a large part of, if you look at it, a lot of organizations, a lot of leaders are thinking, well, hang on, we managed through COVID. We managed to do what we needed to do during that 2-year period where we had restrictions and travel bans and the rest of it. We're done. We know how to work remotely. We know how to do it virtually. And, I would always counter that with, I think during COVID, we survived. What we have to do is to move to a point where our teams, our people are starting to thrive in the digital workplace. There's a completely different sort of feeling to it. So one of the things that we've developed as DS Virtually is we developed a virtual fluency assessment. It looks at the 3 core areas of how do we connect, how do we communicate, and how do we collaborate. And part of it, and if you think about it, whether you've taken a Myers-Briggs or a FIRO or a DISC or any other assessment tool, Lizette, you'll recognize that the first thing that actually really happens is you get a level of awareness you didn't have previously.
Right.
That's that unconscious incompetence. If I don't know what I don't know, I can't do very much about it. And when we actually think about remote working and virtual working, I believe that a lot of it is we, and I'm using the royal we within organizations, that we believe, hey, we know how to do this virtual thing. We used to do work from home Fridays. We did it through COVID. We know how to do this. And I would say that no, you know how to start doing it. But, and again, linking back to some of the other conversations that you and I have had, from a virtual team perspective or a remote working perspective, do you truly know how to connect with your team? Are you really connecting? And as we spoke about last week, personal user manuals. If you're working as part of a remote team, and, okay, you're not going to do it if you've got 300 people in your remote team, but if you've got smaller groups of people, do you truly know them? And it's only when we start putting in place the kind of mechanisms and the tools that we know and recognize that are essential. So things like having personal user manuals, having communication charters and tool set analysis and things like that, that we then start getting to that level of awareness and start seeing where the development gaps are. So our assessment, actually, I think it's about 36 questions that are segmented up into how well we connect, how well we communicate, and how well we collaborate. And part of that is really to start the thinking for that individual to see what they're not doing, and then slowly but surely and incrementally start doing some of those things and seeing the transformation of the team.
I love that. I love that you have an assessment for that because indeed we don't know what we don't know. And it's good sometimes just to take an assessment and to see like how do we compare to other people
Absolutely.
or what would be a good area to start. In one of my workshops, as you know, we do a rate your collaboration exercise where people are asked to rate their collaboration in 4 different areas, just on a sort of a subjective scale of how do you feel
Yep.
about it. But it gives a wonderful picture of like, where would you start, right? Usually it's some sort of an alignment or a
Exactly.
communication area that people rate the lowest. And then you think, ah, okay, let's start here. And it just gives you a good place to dive in. Now, one of your expertises is cultural intelligence.
Mm,
And I want to dive into that because I mean, when we're working remotely, we quickly start to work with people from different countries, which is not the only indicator of culture, right? Culture is also about men versus women and also
yeah, yeah.
old versus young and cat people versus dog people, right? There's all kinds of different things on culture, but uh, we do start to learn, we do start to have to take culture into consideration on remote teams. And so I want to start the conversation by asking, what got you interested in cultural intelligence to begin with?
Yeah, great question. So, if I go back, as I said to you, about 15 years ago, I started to get involved in upskilling facilitators to become virtual facilitators, helping instructional designers to design learning for virtual classroom. And that was part of a whole certifying people to be able to actually transfer their skills from doing traditional face-to-face training to now doing it in a virtual training context. So whether that was using tools like WebEx, Adobe Connect, GoToTraining, the tools that were actually really the ones that were around and more often used going back 15 years ago. I know that in today's virtual classroom world, a lot of virtual classroom training is being delivered in what I would call the virtual meeting tools. Zoom and Teams was never designed to be a virtual training tool. They are unified communication tools at best. They're there to run virtual meetings. But, what we were working with were tools that had built-in polling, they had breakout rooms, they had functionality that a lot of the web conferencing tools didn't have.
Hmm.
And as part of that, there was a project I was involved in where we'd had a set content that was being delivered to predominantly a US audience at this point in time. And we were then brought in to actually now deliver the same content, but to a multicultural audience. And the cohort that I was working with I had a group of 5 or 6 learners who were based in Shanghai, 4 or 5 that were in Beijing, and about 4 that were down in Australia. So you can imagine the dynamic of that. You've got a Brit who sat in the UK working with technology with an audience that technology might be completely foreign for them. English would have been second or third language for the Asian group. Had different cultures that interacted in different ways. And so what really started getting me was me challenging our project leads and saying, well, hang on, you've asked us to run this breakout room activity. We're taking 10 minutes with an American audience, but now you want me to do it with an audience where English might be second or third language, where the way in which they want to interact is going to be different. So and what it flagged for me is I asked a question at one point and just got tumbleweed. I got complete and utter silence.
Wow.
And I'm thinking, this doesn't feel right. What's happening? Is it me? Um, and there was a client I was doing some work with at the time who actually started getting me involved in some of their virtual team delivery. It's a company called TMA World. And they have a tool called the TMA World Prism. And the TMA World Prism actually looks at how culturally we are different, but also how we are similar. And for me, it was almost like going back to my comment about unconscious incompetence. That was a huge unconscious incompetence piece for me with regards to working with people from different cultures. And so your stages of conscious competence go from unconscious incompetence, you don't know what you don't know, to conscious incompetence, you now know what you don't know, to conscious competence, which is that very deliberate stage of you're doing things in a more mechanical way, to unconscious competence, which is it's just natural. You're just doing it as a matter of fact. And so if I take that and then fast forward that probably to, I think it was 2017, I actually did a piece of work with a co-colleague where we actually designed a program called Cultural Intelligence for Learning Professionals. So it kind of deliberately looked at how does culture play out in both virtual and face-to-face training programs? What does it mean for us as learning designers and instructional designers as we look to create content that sits better with a multicultural audience? And alongside that, I did some work with Meeting One, who are an Adobe Connect reseller. And there's an ebook that we're going to give away to people at the end of the podcast, which is 7 expert tips for building culture conscious training sessions or online courses.
One of the things that struck me when we were talking earlier is that you mentioned that different cultures learn in different ways. And I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm going to ask, like, do you have an example or two of highlighting that, how different cultures might learn in different ways, just to make the abstract a little more tangible?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, it's relatively straightforward to make that. So in the West, we very much, from an educator perspective, we learn from and with our teacher. So we are, whether that is from a high school or university perspective, corporate learning, the conversations that tend to happen in those classrooms tend to be much more facilitation. It's much more discussion and dialogue, and it's less about learning from the expert, but learning with the expert, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
When you start moving more towards the East, India, you've got the Gurukula mentality. And then you go to the Far East and you've got the Confucian teacher-pupil mentality, which is, more towards the East. Those cultures expect to learn from the actual facilitator or from the expert, from the leader. So they're less likely to question the credibility of the actual facilitator. They're more likely to be, I don't want to say that they're going to be passive, but they're a little bit more passive than they maybe are in the West. They're not going to, they're going to expect the learning to come to them, for them to absorb it. Culturally, they may want to take a little bit more time to reflect on it before they actually really start thinking about it. But it's very much more in the Western world, we are much more learning with the facilitator. In the Eastern world, it tends to be much more about learning from. And those are, I want to be clear from the outset, those are probably a little bit more generalizations, because what you've actually got is that when you actually then have an individual who is born in Hong Kong, educated in the US, now living in Mexico, the individual might still be Hong Kong by birth, but they have had so many different influences on them that culturally how they are is no longer back to their cultural stereotype.
Right.
There's been things that have shaped them, and I often think about it in terms of, and our listeners may actually have a snigger with this. I don't believe I've got a Scottish accent, because in my mind I don't hear the Scottish brogue, and I often think about it as being a hunk of granite that's actually fallen off the hillside, fallen into a stream, and over time the waters have actually smoothed off that chunk of granite into a rounded pebble, as being how my accent sounds to me, because I don't feel as though I'm hugely Scottish one way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
But so the culture thing absolutely fascinates me. And if we fast forward to current day, of course, each and every single one of us could probably say, well, hang on, I've got friends, colleagues that do come from these different cultures, and we just work together, we just communicate, we just connect. And I would actually turn around and say, yeah, we do. But how often are we actually maybe imposing on them? And they're actually just accepting of it, or they're not saying anything, they're being polite. I mean, let me give you a great example of that. Most of the world is right-handed. So as a right-handed individual, if I come and meet with you physically, I'm going to reach out with my right hand to shake your hand. But what if you're left-handed? And I don't know that. I've just given you probably one of the most awkward things for you to do, which is now to actually shake hands firmly
Yeah.
with the wrong hand. And we end up getting that awkward moment. And to me, culture is one of those things that culture is not so obvious until it is obvious, if that makes sense. It's not until you're in a situation where you think, oh, hang on. So that's why that happened. Or that's why an individual didn't respond in the meeting. It wasn't that they weren't part of the meeting. It wasn't that they weren't engaged. It was their culture or their processing or their thinking stopped them from doing it then and then.
So if people are listening to this podcast, we've now gone from the unconscious incompetence to the conscious incompetence, right? A lot of us are realizing like, maybe I don't know so much about the
Yep.
culture on my team. So now what? How can we discover what
Sure.
some of the cultural aspects are on our team that we should be aware of?
So there's many different tools out there. Some of them are free to use. Some of them actually you have to pay to use them. There is huge depths of learning. I mean, the I guess the gurus around cross cultural intelligence are the Geert, in fact, fellow Dutch, Fons Trompenaar, Geert Hofstede. They are the ones that really are credited more with actually us being able to understand culture on a personal or individual level. And there are plenty of tools out there. The one of that comes to mind is Kiss, Bow, Shake Hands. And what they are is they are tools which have been designed to help an individual embed themselves in a different culture. So if let's say I got a team assignment for my company, and now I'm actually going to be out in Singapore for the next 6 months. It would make sense for me as a Brit moving to Singapore to get a sense of the Singaporean culture. So I might go to something like Kiss, Bow, Shake Hands or any of the other tools that are actually out there and start to begin to understand, well, what are the things that I shouldn't be doing in that culture? What are some of the real cultural mistakes that I want to avoid? Because, I want to embed in that culture, not stand out in that culture.
Right.
So there is very much a part of it which has got to be develop a sense of awareness. Understand how culture is different, but also how culture is similar. There is, if I remember right, in the ebook, it doesn't actually give you there was an accompanying guide on the ebook, which we'll make sure that that's part of the podcast and people can download it afterwards. But there is a general ready reckoner that we can actually provide to them that actually gives a kind of little taster. It's not going to give all of the answers, but the first thing in terms of becoming culturally intelligent is to become culturally aware, is to understand where those differences and similarities might be.
I love that. And I really, back to the personal user manual, that's such a great tool to start understanding somebody else.
Yeah.
And like I said, it's not just about different countries, but or different languages. It's more like, how do you prefer to receive feedback? Like some people like my husband, he likes just punch them in the face, like just give it to him straight.
Yeah.
Somebody
Yeah.
more like me, I'm way more sensitive. Like, don't punch me in the face. Like, I like writing and be a little bit gentle. And, like there's different styles to that. And not that we have to, we have to give everybody their own style, but it is certainly good to be aware of it. And I think that those awarenesses start the conversation about culture and
Yeah.
allow us to connect a little bit, because then we can ask out of curiosity and not out of like, hey, that's different, why are you different?
Yeah.
More like, oh, you like to receive it this way, tell me more about that.
Well, even if I mean, one of the things that fascinated me right at the very get-go, so the TMA World Prism focuses on 3 levels. It focuses on relating, which is how we actually want to interact with one another. It looks at regulating, which is how we actually manage power, time, and authority, and then reasoning, which is how we think and how we present. And if you actually look at the works that Hofstede, Trompenaars, Livermore, Lewis, so many other individuals out there doing some great work around organizational cultural awareness. The more we can actually simplify the understanding of what those differences and similarities can be, the easier it is for us to interpret. So if I turn around and said to you and give you a couple of examples, and these are more generalizations than fact, because of course, typically you can define a culture as having a tendency towards one way or another. Right. So in terms of how we actually think about time is a really amazing one, and particularly as we think about scheduling time with people to connect and communicate and collaborate with them. Think about time as something that in each of the 9 dimensions of the 3 categories are continuums. So, individually we can be towards one end of one continuum, or we can be at the other end of it. And so when we think about how cultures use time, what we've actually got is at one end it's tight, and at the other end it's loose. So a culture that would actually probably fit into the category of being very tight in use of their time would be Germany and Switzerland. They're the kind of timekeepers of our world. So when we actually schedule a meeting with people in those sort of regions, you're more likely it's 10 o'clock we're meeting. You don't want to be there at 10:05. That's disrespectful. It's 10 o'clock, and it's not people being pedantic. It's the way they lead their lives. So culture is very much, I'm not trying to get up in the morning and annoy you. It's just how I am. It's the way we are, which is what culture is. At the very opposite end of that continuum, we've got loose in terms of our use of time. And, cultures that would actually tend to be more loose with their time, Latin America, maybe Spain, maybe parts of the Middle East. And there's an interesting second category that tends to tie in alongside that, which is how we actually want to manage, or how we want to interact with one another, which is task-focused and relationship-focused. And when you overlay those two, so task-focused, time is money. Let's get down to the detail. Let's get things done now. Relationship-focused, I need to understand you better. I need us to be able to sort of build that kind of initial trust within our relationship before I can really start to work with you and be more effective. So what you've actually got is you can see a lot of these cultures, differences and similarities coming into play in the way that communication happens, the way that people speak with you. So again, if I think about, let's say I've got somebody from Germany, and again, I don't mean to be stereotyping here. It's in general, the Germanic mentality is that, okay, I'm going to meet with Lizette. I'm meeting at 10 o'clock with Lizette, and we're going to discuss the podcast that we're going to do. So the focus is on time first, then it's the individual, and then it's the task. Mm-hmm. And that could be interchangeable, but if the focus is very much time focused. If you're in Latin America, let's say you're Juan and you're down in Rio de Janeiro, Juan might turn and say, yeah, I'm meeting with Lizette today to talk about a podcast at around 10 o'clock. So the focus changes because, if it's, Hans who's over there in Germany, he may turn around and think, hang on, it's all about the time. It's all about, I must get this done on that time. Whereas Juan's saying, I can get there as long as we're meeting together. It's all about the people. It's all about the relationships. So, in the time that we set aside to do this podcast, we're not going to do culture a huge service. We really want to ignite people's passions and understandings that culturally we're all different. No one from any culture is trying to be awkward or confusing. The confusion comes from the cultures coming together. And I think it's Lewis has a great book, which is When Cultures Collide, which I think is a fascinating way to look at it. It's when those two cultures come together, there's a kind of clashing of the cultures. That's not to say one's right and one's wrong. Both are just different. How people are. And I think it's fair to say that if we think that in today's world, we will all see culture happening around us, whether it's with our friendship groups, our social groups, whether it's with our working colleagues, whether it's, you walk out into the street and you see people from different cultures, different backgrounds, they will all have different ways of interacting. And I think really, for me, when I actually talk about virtual fluency in terms of being a holistic view as to how we enable our people to actually transform the ways in which they connect, communicate, and collaborate, there's much more awareness that we need to create rather than just providing a stick of technology that's going to help them.
I love that. Yeah, and indeed, and the next step I always say beyond the personal user manual is to create an agreement for working together. And this is where we can normalize all of these behaviors, right? We
Yes.
normalize, and it's a platform for the discussion of all of these behaviors. Indeed, I love that. So we're running out of time, but I still have a couple questions. So they're going to be quick questions but I want to ask about the ebook that we have for people. So I'm going to start with that. So I'm going to just what is in this ebook and where can people find it? We'll put it in the show notes, of course, so people can find it there. But tell us a little bit about what's in the ebook.
So the ebook was I did a webinar with Meeting One back in 2017, which is off the back of cultural intelligence for learning professionals. And so what the ebook does is very neatly, it's 7 expert tips for building culture conscious online courses. So what it's actually looking at is what are some of the very tactical things that we can do as instructional designers when we're designing learning that's going to be delivered to multicultures. So some of it may be, as I look to my left here, things like adjusting your session timings. If we actually take whether it's a virtual classroom or face-to-face classroom, and we fill every single second of every minute of every hour that we're delivering training to that person, that audience, we have no buffer time on which the facilitator might need to adjust the delivery. So again, it's thinking about the sensitivity of that. It's thinking about activities. If I turn around to you, and you got to forgive me here, Lizette, I speak one language. Well, technically, I could probably claim to speak two. I speak Scottish first and English second. But I speak one language. So I don't have this gymnastics that my mind has to do as I translate from one language to the next. But if you think about it, if we're delivering learning to an audience where English might be their second or even the third language in some instances, and we're doing a lot of our delivery of learning is oral, it's a bit vocal, then we're asking that person to do a lot of brain gymnastics in terms of them receiving what you've just said, getting past any accents, deciphering it, working it in their mind, and then starting to think about how they respond, putting it back into, hearing in English, putting it back into Thai, or putting it back into Indian or whatever, and then having to retranslate it so they then respond to you in English. That's a huge amount of gymnastics. So again, there's part of it in terms of how do we create the psychological safety for learners in that learning environment. There's some cultures around the world, less so now. Bear in mind this ebook was written 2017, so 6 years ago. Is that whole sense of technology and technology familiarity in virtual classrooms. 6, 7, 8 years ago, people maybe weren't there. COVID accelerated that because we suddenly put everyone into Microsoft Teams meetings and Zoom meetings. One of the things that always fascinates me, and it's something that I always think about when we run virtual meetings with multicultural audiences, is don't rely on a single response mechanism. So if you think about it, if I turn around and I've got a multicultural team where some of those individuals might have an accent or English second language, and they don't articulate verbally that clearly, it's not their fault. I mean, hey, you should hear my my Spanish, my French, and I keep mixing the two.
I'm learning Dutch, so yeah,
so and they will say that someone from the Netherlands will immediately know that you don't speak, you're not Dutch.
Yeah.
But creating alternative response mechanisms. I love when we run virtual events that our virtual audiences can actually drop into using chat, as long as we tell them to, and as long as we monitor it as virtual meeting hosts. Because quite often, someone that has English second or English third language, or has an accent that they've got to work with when they deliver verbal commentary, doesn't have that when they type it into chat. So that becomes much easier. Understanding audience or participant expectations of you as an instructor, that talks to the Western ways and the Eastern ways in terms of teacher-pupil mentality. One of the great ones, and I know that we're going to do a webinar, and during that webinar, we're going to play Idiom Jeopardy, which I'll give people a little bit of a teaser for, is, one of the things that happens so very, very, very often, and I challenge anyone to think about how they interact on a day-by-day basis. Our languages are often peppered with idioms and slang. Now, if you think about it, so in the UK, for instance, I might turn and say, "Well, look, Lizette, I'm not pulling your leg," which is I'm not trying to fool you. I'm not trying to
Yeah.
convince you of something that's not right. If somebody actually, where English might be second or third language, hears that, and now they've got to translate that back into their mother tongue, they might turn and go, what on earth was that?
Yeah,
What did David
yeah.
mean by that? Americans tend to be very much sports oriented. You've hit that out the park. You hit a home run on that one. Well, what if that person doesn't know what baseball is? They don't know what a home run is. So the use of our language, we've got to be much more cautious, much more clear in terms of how we use language. In our Jeopardy game, and I'll give you a bit of a teaser. I used earlier, "I'm not pulling your leg," which is the English expression in terms of, I'm not trying to fool you. In Russia, they use one which is, we're not putting noodles on your ears. It means exactly the same. It's fascinating, and so there's a whole sense of it. So the ebook covers those 7 elements quite neatly, but it's down to, if we don't understand those around us, and as you and I have discussed so many times, personal user manuals are taking us from the fact that we know people's roles, we know people's identities, we know their name, to actually going so much deeper and learning so much more about our audience. There are multiple depths that we can actually go to and need to go to. And often you may turn around and say, okay, I only do that, or I only have that desire to jump into that when it causes me a problem. And there's part of it for me, which is try and get that awareness before it causes a problem for you and for your colleagues.
I love that. I love that. It's we want to go to conscious competence, right? So now we we have unearthed a whole bunch of things that have made us consciously incompetent. I love this phrase. I'm gonna have to get used to it though before I start using it. All right, David, we're running out of time. So the very last question for today is, if people want to connect with you online, where is the best place to find you? Where do you live online?
So I'm on LinkedIn. They can find me under the phrase of DS Virtually. My profile online, I think, is linkedin.com/DS Virtually. My email address is david@DS Virtually. So that's david@dsvirtually.com. So they can reach out to me there. I'm sure we can probably put that detail into the show notes. And I'm very much a pay it forward kind of guy in terms of thinking. So it's never a case of, oh, you've asked that of me, well, I need to ask you to pay this invoice. I'm very free with the knowledge that I share. I mean, every ebook that I've written is available online. If you get to my LinkedIn profile, there's probably 6 or 7 or 8 different ebooks that I've written over the time that are on there. And I don't, for me, it's a case of they're there to be used. My mission is that I think about it in terms of Steve Jobs. He put a fantastic phrase out there, which is, we're here to put a dent in the universe, else why be here? Now, I'm not naive enough to think that I'm going to put a dent in the universe, which is solving world peace or stopping the wars or anything like that. But as long as I can actually put a dent in people's universe, so whether it's an individual, whether it's a team that I'm working with, or a training department that I'm working with, that's good enough for me. That, if I can achieve that, I've achieved it. So lots of information on my LinkedIn profile, articles that I write, so there's plenty of opportunity there.
So you heard it here first, audience. David has a generous amount of information to give away for free on the LinkedIn profile, so don't miss out on that. David, I want to thank you so much for giving us all your time and your wisdom. I took copious notes, even with an extra sticky note, because there's even more underneath. I really appreciate all that you had to share today. Thank you so much.
Lizette, thank you very much. And I look forward to hearing from people.
All right, everybody, until next time,
Thanks
be
very much.
powerful.